Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. And yes, you are in the right place. This is the Human Risk podcast. Although regular listeners may be wondering why Christian is sounding a little different from usual. Well, that's because Christian is putting human risk into practice by handing over control of his beloved podcast to me. I'm Sarah Abramson, usually host of the Speak to the Human podcast. And Christian and I have previously been interviewees on each other's pods, but I put it to him that it would be even more fun to turn the mic on the man himself on his own show. So, Christian, welcome to Human Risk.
Thank you so much for having me.
So far, I'm not hearing the panic or regret from you.
There's still time.
There is. I feel like I've been really lucky to have had some super interesting chats with you in the last couple of years, and along with hearing you speak and following your often entertaining social posts, that's given me just a little window into how you think, the kind of intriguing things that you come across in your work, and some of the brilliant stories you've got up your sleeve too. So I think it'll be fun to give you a chance to talk about some of that, a kind of behind the scenes perspective and a bit of an exploration of what you see in your work. So I guess I should start by saying thank you for being up for this.
Thanks for offering to do it. I'm excited. And look, I think one of the things that's really interesting, and one of the reasons I love this format, is talking about stuff. You often will say things that one has never said before, right? Or in a different way to the way one said things before. And I think the idea of exploring behind the scenes, I love it. And I think it's really interesting. So I'm completely up for it. Let's see where we end up.
Yeah, awesome. So I think let's start with sort of thinking about the sphere that you work in, which is, I think you describe it broadly as understanding human behaviour as a risk. I'm kind of interested in what first caught your attention and made it irresistible to explore that whole area further. What was it?
I trace this back, and I recognize, the risk of what I do is you start to sort of see the flaws in your own thinking. But I trace this back to childhood and a curiosity and a sort of willingness, particularly where it came to why were people doing what they were doing? Why were people behaving in a particular way? And it probably extended to people dressed slightly differently or looking slightly different. And and I have just these memories of me pointing at them as a kid. And my parents, while respecting other people, were also very good at allowing me to ask those silly questions. And so I always have this sort of recollection of it's okay to ask questions. And I was just naturally very curious about stuff. Got me into trouble later on. There are certain scenarios in which you shouldn't ask questions or point stuff out. But that's where it sort of started. So I think it's always been there on some level. And it was only really when I was in this position of eating my own regulatory cooking, in other words, having to do risk and compliance within a firm where I'd been the regulator on the other side of the fence, where I sort of felt this isn't working and it's kind of my fault because I've imposed these things. Why is this not working? And then I sort of trawled my brains for solutions, and I kind of realized, this may well be me looking for I had a solution to something and I was looking for the right problem, where I just kind of went, I think this is all about people and we're not thinking about people. And then as I looked back, I had spent an entire career being interested in this stuff. So I had, I did a literature degree, which if we think about literature is all about people. We tend not to write stories about inanimate objects. We write about humans and what makes them do what they do. And so there was a fascination there. And then I'd always been on loads of courses. And as I looked at my bookshelves at home, there were tons of books on this topic. So clearly on some level, I'd been interested in it, but I hadn't really had the outlet for it. And suddenly I managed to find that. Either it was there or I created it. But either way, that's sort of how it happened. So I think there's just this latent interest in, it's probably nosiness, Sarah, to be honest. Let's just start with that and just go, it's just driven by sheer nosiness as to what's going on and having a framing that allows me to be nosy.
I think that's a great place to start. It's, you could call it curiosity, couldn't you? But I think you did that. Willingness and curiosity of asking questions and trying to understand why things don't make sense. Because I think what you're getting at there is that there's a kind of irrationality. There's, often human behaviour is couched as something that should make sense. We ought to do things because it's the logical thing to do. It's in the interests of whatever we're trying to achieve. It's in our self-interest. But often people don't do those things that actually would make sense for them. Why is that? Like trying to dig into it, I think is super interesting.
And there's an interesting thing there about, why should it be that we're logical, right? We obviously shouldn't do things that put us in great danger. So that might be a slightly different set of scenarios, but there's this expectation that we're rational and sensible. But that's kind of come from, I think, people trying to impose order on the world. And it is much easier if people behave in a predictable manner, right? And of course, if you look at it as a traffic context, for example, we need people to behave relatively predictably. You don't want people sort of, there's a red light, they drive through it. We know what will happen if everybody decides to, well, there are certain cities you can go to in the world where people don't respect the traffic rules, and you can see the chaos that follows. But there is this expectation that we all behave rationally. And I think we know, if we're honest with ourselves, that none of us does.
Hmm.
And so in a way, you could flip it around and say, it's perhaps surprising that we behave as quote unquote rationally as we do, because I think we're all on some level free spirits.
No, absolutely. I think there's some commonality often, though, isn't there, about the situations where you might see that irrationality really coming to life, where it's most obvious or where it's perhaps most problematic, which kind of leads me to asking you about the types of situations that you work in. So I know you've got a career background in financial services, but that you've really spread your wings with human risk into working across a real variety of sectors and organizations. And I think I'm right in saying, please correct me, but you've worked from life sciences and NGOs to military. I think you've worked in nuclear power. Is that right? And even like casinos and things. And I'm not sure we should even be contemplating these this kind of potent combination in one sentence.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because you're absolutely right. When I started out, my lived experience was financial services, and that's where I'd spotted the problem. And so my initial thinking had always been it'll be a financial services thing, and maybe, I don't know, maybe it'll be relevant to things that feel like financial services. Sort of, I could stretch financial services to say, well, if we think about what that means nowadays, those are data businesses, so maybe that takes me into tech, and maybe I can stretch a little bit further. And that was the original thing. And I don't know whether it was a function of the pandemic, because I started my business in 2019, or whether it was naturally going to happen anyway. But as the world shifted slightly, and my business that was originally going to be doing lots of face-to-face stuff became much more me doing digital things in order to promote the business, but also to engage clients because I couldn't go there physically. What I started to realize was that this challenge is universal. And, I should have known that in a way, because the definition of human risk was a universal definition, right? It didn't reference banks. It just was a universal sort of truism that I come up with. And I started to see, and in fact, it wasn't me that started to see so much. It was people saw things in what I was saying, and they were the ones that made the link. And so many of the clients that I've got come not from me targeting those industries or even positioning myself to think I can help those industries. It's people have seen something and they've seen between the lines and thought, oh, that's interesting. You can help us in our context. And I almost can go there without having to have any knowledge. And in fact, sometimes it's a benefit not having a knowledge, particularly if you're trying to change processes, is not being steeped in the way things are done in a particular industry can be quite powerful. Mm. And so, yeah, over time, I've built up this very eclectic portfolio of clients who, and to answer the other part of your question is none of whom, there isn't a consistent rollout thing here where it's always doing the same thing. Is they will all have their own challenges that are unique to their industry / company, but there's commonality across because we're trying to do the same thing, which is to understand people and be able to influence them. So, some people it'll be looking at training. How do we make that more effective? Some of them's communication. Some of them it's just thinking about their entire program. Some of them are interested in unintended consequences. Some want me to help them to look at reporting and how they talk about the risks within the organization, remembering that the way we report things drives the conversations that we have about that. And so I never quite know, and I never quite know who's going to come knocking on the door. And I think one of the things that's interesting is that there are lots of organizations I could help because they employ people, and therefore what I do would be relevant to them. But they have to want to do that.
Yes.
And so just because somebody ought to logically want my services doesn't necessarily mean that they will or are able to financially or politically or for a ton of other reasons.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that is fascinating is when you look at And there are lots of people out there that will tell you how to do this, right? Lots of self-appointed experts on LinkedIn that will tell you to find your target audience and market to them and blah, 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 blah. Well, I could do that. I could tell you who, in theory, my ideal customer avatar would be, to use the sort of marketing spiel. But actually, I don't know, because it requires some people's willingness to do this. Because you have to sort of wake them up to the idea this is a possibility, and it resonates with some people, it doesn't resonate with others for a variety of behavioral reasons. And what's interesting about it is, in order to understand how my stuff lands and where it lands, I need to think behaviorally, because ultimately, what I'm not doing, back to your rationality thing, there is a business rationale behind what we do, but you kind of have to buy into it on an emotional level. And so a lot of what I've been thinking about this in terms of other contexts. If I think about the way cars are sold to us, sure, there are numbers there, right? There's a price, obviously. There are features there, the sort of engine capacity, or electric cars, it's sort of range they'll be put out there. But the large part of that is actually an emotional sale. And I think, that's somehow we have to, within the confines of our budget, we'll look for a car that connects with us, with our needs, and that we feel good about buying, generally speaking. And I think the same's true of the service here. Just because you should want to buy it doesn't mean you do. And I get loads of people who love what I do, but haven't yet found the use case. And so one of the interesting business dynamics that comes off the back of that is lead times. People talk about the sales funnel. Well, I've had sort of 5-year lead times on some things, because people haven't found themselves in the right position, with the right budget, with the right political support to make the changes they want. Suddenly they change jobs, or they get a new boss, or there's a budget available for something, and we can shift that. And so it is really interesting that I have to think about it not as a business model that one can, where you can sort of codify and stratify the world. It's, in a way, I talk about it and go, this is technically a B2B business, albeit that the B on my side is a company of one. But actually, it's a little bit more C2C in many respects, in the sense that I have to, I've got to connect with a human somewhere that has enough interest to be able to push things forward. And I don't necessarily know in which industry, in which job title that human is going to exist. And hence I have to put the stuff out there and see who responds to it.
I really like that way of describing it, the C2C thing. And that's something that I talk about internally here at Actian a lot, where I'm saying, although we are in a B2B business, we're doing consultancy, we're doing creative agency work. Nevertheless, you have to make that work connect with the human that is your client. So it's still a person, and you still have to understand their motivations, their needs to make a business case internally, or to show that what they're doing is making a big difference. So it's still, I really like that way of saying, well, it's basically all C2C, isn't it? I'm a person, you're a person. I sort of find a way to connect. But I really like what you've just said there about the kind of triggers, I suppose, but also, are people yet ready to work with you? So it may be that sometimes some people don't get why they should work with you in the first place, but there may be other people who do, but they just are not yet in a position. But there's something around that I do want to ask you about and explore about the. I wonder if there's sort of two almost extremes of situation where an organization might come to you. This might be wrong, but just to put it to you, where with some people, it's people who already think this way. So, I'm thinking of people like you had Fraser Simpson from Welcome recently on the pod, who is just incredibly open-minded about how he works. He understands the whole concept of human risk and what that looks like, and why you need to engage deeply with it. So he's already thinking that way, and he looks for support. He looks for input for doing that even better. And then at the other end, maybe there are organizations where there's a burning platform, maybe there's been a crisis, maybe something has gone deeply wrong, and they're kind of in emergency mode of like, we need to sort this out. How do we do it? What do we do? And I wonder if does that resonate? But also, is there this big group in the middle where it's like the bell curve, isn't it? This big group of organizations where they don't even realize that there is a problem. And that problem will manifest in different ways in different places. And I know when I worked as a freelancer with sort of 5 different organizations at the same time, I would see each place had some sort of different issue. It just looked different in different organizations. And you'd have your own challenge with that culture or that client or that way of handling things or that process. And nowhere is problem free. And that problem inevitably comes from the people that work there that are creating it. But do you experience that? Is there a sort of frustration around the fact that there's this whole group in the middle where the leaders are potentially not even recognizing that they need to do something, and things could be better? Or
Yes.
all right, yeah.
No, completely. And as you were talking, I was thinking, what are the criteria? And I think, and this isn't a complete list, but I sort of tend to say it doesn't matter what the underlying realities are. I need one of, I think, three things to be in place for people to want to turn to me. And that is presupposing that they might buy my analysis, but they might not like me or my solution to the problem. I can recognize that as well. But I typically say, either something has gone wrong, either within their organization or within somewhere else where you can see enough of a parallel. So a competitor firm, for example, where they go, oh, so they have to face reality. And often because I'm working with compliance people, it'll be the the regulator has told them to do something. So even if it's okay in their shop, somebody else's might have a problem and they need to do something about it or be seen to be doing something about it. So that's sort of solution one. The second place where I get a bit of traction is somebody who's fresh in post, the sort of first 100 days logic, where they kind of come in and they either want to make a change or want to be seen to making a change. And that's often the driver of people, who like my stuff, they've suddenly got the opportunity because they're in a new place, right? And they've got that sort of ability to shift things and change things in the first 100 days. Or the third category, which I think is the most interesting and points to the way the way you were talking about things, is people that have viscerally known, not necessarily consciously, but sort of known that things aren't quite working. We're spending a lot of money on something, and I kind of know it's not right. It just doesn't feel very human, I would argue. But I've never had the key to unlock it. And so suddenly when I present it to them and frame it in the way that I do, so if I, for example, framing compliance as the business of influencing human decision making, but we could also, reframe other contexts using a sort of behavioral lens and saying, what is it? What's the behavioral challenge here? Suddenly, when you present to people like that, they've never thought about it in that way. It's possibly they've thought about it as a logical problem as opposed to an emotional problem, or a sort of rational problem as opposed to a human problem. And so presenting them with that solution suddenly means that they're like, oh, okay, I can now grapple with that issue because I now see a way through that mess. It was a box I didn't want to open, if you like. And so as I look at those three categories, they're all massively unpredictable, right?
Mhm.
I mean, I could spend my whole time sort of ambulance chasing and looking for things that have gone wrong, and there is some merit to that. But you can't always predict where things are going to go wrong. And that's not, unless you're sort of charging a massive amount of money, it's not a great sustainable business thing because emergencies don't always happen when you need them to, and they can often have not a great business for a company. One, I would argue, in many respects, but the other two, people change jobs when they choose to change jobs or have job changes imposed on them. And the third one is the one that one can probably tap into most frequently. And so that drives a lot of my thinking in terms of saying, actually, it's tapping into it. Because if I can tap into a human frustration, and that's typically what there's this thing rattling around, right? I know this doesn't quite feel right, but I don't have a key with which to unlock it. That's really powerful because suddenly, and you can see the eyes lighting up and they're like, oh, and that's the strongest level of engagement I have because I've spoken to something that's been rattling around in their head for a period of time, and they may not have thought too much about it because if a ready solution doesn't present itself, often, unless we've got that ready solution or something that really strikes us, we just sort of stick it on the back burner somewhere. And so I think those three categories tend to be the drivers for when I'm allowed to come and help people out.
Interesting. And so obviously this is a really broad area, and you've already sort of touched on the types of problems that people might be bringing you, the business challenges that you're working in. But how have you turned that into a business model that you can actually earn a living from? And tell us a little bit more about the types of challenges, the actual work that you do with people.
Yeah, so I think the business thing for me becomes because it's not, again, because it's not a rational purchase. I can't say, well, I need to target X number of companies and then statistically Y number will buy the product, right? It doesn't work on that basis. I mean, and if it does, I'm missing it. I'm always willing to admit that when I talk about how I do things, that I've missed something and there is a genius way of handling this just beyond me, but I haven't yet found it. So typically what I'm doing is trying to spread stuff out as much as possible. And hence, I do a ton of stuff on social media to solve this problem, or go to conferences and try and get to the broadest possible audience. Because particularly where I can't see those connections and they can, if I sort of had to choose how I'd be targeting people, I'll be missing a load of people that were potential clients, and I'd be targeting a load of people that weren't necessarily in the right space. So I need to spread it quite broad, and I think a lot of it is around the product, and the company is inextricably linked to me.
Mm.
And so when I first started out, I had this big thing about, human risk and separate identities, right? And so I created the website, and the website was very much around we and this corporate identity.
Hmm.
And I thought that was the sensible way to go, right? The company needs a separate identity. That's the legal structure. It's a separate thing. It's not the same as me. And then I had this really interesting experience where was actually thanks to Twitter, which is not something you can often say, where I had two separate Twitter accounts. I refuse to call it by that new name. And one was the company account, and one was the personal account. And I tweeted from the wrong one, which logically must mean I sent something personal from the business account, because I'd be less bothered about sending something business from the personal account. And I was, oh my God, wrong account. And that got me thinking about what's the difference between the two things. And the answer I realized, thanks to this Twitter lens that I'd given myself, was that actually there wasn't really any major difference. If I was complaining about customer service that I don't know, airlines lost my luggage or something, then that's a personal matter, right? That's not a corporate thing. That becomes a personal thing. And so that sits in the personal account. But beyond that, actually, there's a great amount of freedom. I'm not particularly bothered. And that was quite a liberating moment, because suddenly I realized that actually it was all, given the company was me, and we can test this out, because if I were to market my company and say, I'm not going to be delivering this, but someone else is, I think lots of people would feel deceived, not probably the right word, even if the person knew what they were doing. Ultimately, I'm the face of this thing, and people sort of expect me to show up and do this. And so having realized that, a lot of the thing is not just about buying solutions. It is about buying solutions with a kind of Christianified twist, if you like, in terms of how they're presented, both in terms of style, but also nature of content, presentation style. The formats that I'll use to deliver these things are very based around me. And I realized that the trick that enabled me to be more successful was to recognize that dynamic and lean into it.
Yeah.
So rather than trying to pretend that this corporate entity has a sort of corporate sterility to it, is for the thing to be fully me.
Yeah.
And therefore for me to own that and push the company in a direction that makes sense for me, that gets the best out of me. And therefore, when you're buying the company, you're absolutely buying me. And the brand therefore just becomes a sort of label to stand behind, as opposed to something that's different. And I think when you're self-employed and something is all consuming, and the problem I have is I spend my whole life wandering around looking, I've got so many photos on my phone of things I have taken pictures of that I can't quite explain why, but there's something there. And then it'll occur to me later on what that might be. When it's all consuming, I can't switch off in that sense. Removing that barrier was a huge kind of relief to me in a way, because it meant I no longer had to think so hard, and things would flow. And once I've done that, then it became a lot easier in terms of knowing how to do marketing, recognizing the risk appetite of what I wanted to do. Much less of a logical thing and much more driven by gut instinct. Clearly, always when in business, at some point you have to be logical, because there are processes you have to do accounts and things like that. I say one has to. I have people. I have an accountant that does that for me, but you have those sorts of things that so you do have. There is a bit of process rules, if you like, that you have to put in place. But bottom line is, I link those two things. I can't remember what the question was.
Well,
but
yeah,
anyway.
neither can I. I mean, it completely makes sense, doesn't it? Because, I mean, your whole shtick is that we're looking at humans. So bringing your human self to your business completely makes sense.
Yeah, it
You're
would be a bit
living it,
weird,
being
wouldn't it?
well,
Right, just
yeah,
to have a sort
exactly.
of
But I
yeah.
do get it as well. I was self-employed and had my own business. Actually, when I all the way through that, and I think because I started it relatively young, I set myself up as a limited company. And I think that initially was to do with confidence, because you have to charge for yourself, and you have to be willing to say, I am worth this, and put yourself out there. And I think that takes quite a lot of confidence. You are marketing yourself. I was going to say selling yourself. There's a sort of side to that, but doesn't quite sound so positive. You know what I mean? You have to put yourself out there as the business. And for me, to get going with that, certainly to build what I felt like was a, a base that I was confident in and a reputation. I felt like I needed a shop front and a window and a brand that I could confidently stand behind. And I think I certainly did grow in confidence with making that myself. But I really love how you're talking about this as bringing yourself to the business and blurring those lines between yourself and your brand. And what I see with how you express yourself, and it'd be great to ask you to talk about this a little bit, is the elements of your personality that you've brought into your brand. I mean, you use certain visualizations, you use certain ways of, just kind of talking about concepts. How do you see that, and how deliberately have you done that?
So I think once I'd it's a great observation, because once I'd broken the barrier between the two things, suddenly you start to think, okay, actually, if I'm gonna take this as a strength and recognize that that is what's there, that if I'm inextricably tied to it, clearly the upsides of what I bring are business upsides, and the downsides of what I might bring, the things that could put some people off. And I think it's really important to recognize that if you're going out there and putting yourself out there, some people are not going to like it.
Hmm.
And that's fine, right? That's absolutely fine. I don't want to create something generic that appeals to everybody. I need enough people to appeal to, but I think there's something to be said for pursuing that. And so as I looked at, well, how do I lean into that properly? Then you start to think, well, actually, I need to make this be as close to me as possible, and find joy in and pursue the things that are uniquely me, the mix of things. So whether that's taking the fact that I spend a ton of time on trains, right, because I find it very therapeutic, I love it, and it's a way of travel that works well for me. Bringing that into the marketing on social media, or not even the marketing, but just bringing it into the content on social media, just felt like a natural thing. And so I'm looking for things that I can, stand behind. So I'm not following a sort of schedule of this is what you should do. I've seen there's tons of people, again, back to these people on LinkedIn that tell you how to do, they're like, this is how you crack it, right? I've cracked the algorithm. This is how you do it. I think, I don't want to be doing something that somebody else has told me to do when it comes to, sure, if we're looking at something like first aid, right, of course I'm going to pay attention to somebody else. I'm not going to invent my own way of doing that. But when it comes to sort of marketing and tone of voice and those sorts of things, it has to be authentically me.
Mm.
Because if the product is me, then you kind of need to make sure that you have that authentic voice. And so I started to think, well, how do I lean into that? And so how can I find the things that energize me or that are part of my existence that I think could be interesting to share? And that's not about revealing every aspect of everything, but it's about saying, is this, let's find a vehicle for things that interest me that I can make relevant to what I'm doing, not in a crass way, but in an authentic way. And that also helps sustain content, because you will always have things to talk about. But from a sort of business perspective, it also gives you, it gives you that unique characteristic. It means that somebody else can't come along and easily replicate what's there, because even if they stole every bit of content I've ever put out, there's a ton more, and they wouldn't be able to authentically continue to do that. We can question whether AI could manage that. It's an interesting challenge, but then everybody's facing that. But I'm looking for things that are just uniquely me, that I feel comfortable talking about, that are sustainable. That allows me to sustain the content, but it also means hopefully there's something interesting in, because I'm not following somebody else's template. I'm talking about things that genuinely interest me, that I've learned from. And of course, some of the putting content together, and even this show, right, is about talking about things in order to try and get a new, fresh perspective on things.
Mm.
So writing things down, filming a video on something can be a way of, serve several purposes. If I put a video out there, I have to think about the subject myself. So something sparked my attention. I have to think about it to be able to create the video, right? That's doing something. It goes out there, people respond to it. That gives it alternative ideas and perspectives. And one of the things I've recently realized is that I have this theory. There's no scientific basis to this whatsoever, but I just love this idea of, I think we all have the need to get our ideas out. Things that rattle around in our heads
Yes.
need to be released at some point. And they need to be released at some point. One, because there's no point having those thoughts and ideas if they're not sent somewhere. I mean, lovely as they are bouncing around your head, but I think you get much more of it by putting them out there. And one of the reasons I think that's really important is, if you don't do that, then there's no space for fresh ideas, fresh thinking. And so getting stuff out of my head and out there and seeing what happens to it, does this resonate with other people, becomes an absolutely key part of it. So I'm always looking for ways that I can kind of just release my thinking into the world. And that's why I love, social media for me works on that basis really well. It's a great outlet to be able to just be consistently putting things out there without the need to write a book on every idea that one has.
Yeah, and I think you do it so well. I think you've got a real talent for kind of like you're talking about kind of blurring the lines between what sort of traditionally counts as work. Is this like an office hours? Is this something that I could put into a timesheet? Don't get me started on timesheets. And I'm starting myself on timesheets. But that kind of willingness to think it doesn't have to be categorized as work or non-work. And I think that's particularly interesting in a space like compliance or risk, where traditionally, or people might have preconceptions about what that is, and that it's quite straight-laced, and you've got to,
Yeah.
it's all about the rules, and it's all about, this is very much about time in the office and ways of measuring things, and all of that kind of view of what work means. I think you do this so well that you have such a different approach, and you express it through different forms, but especially social media, but also in podcasting, where you're picking up different ideas, and you are looking at life in general and the interesting stuff that you see that brings a lens to this and that reflects something interesting, a human idea, a different way of thinking about behavior. And I think I put it to you recently that you, in my mind, you're a little bit of a collector of ideas and behaviors and things, because you have these sort of mini brands, if you like, of the sort of compliance in the wild, which I love. They're just like crazy things that you see, and pictures and signs and stuff, which is like, this doesn't make sense. And you're not necessarily having to write a massive long article to express it. You are putting it out there and saying, I found this. What do you think? Kind of doesn't make sense to me. And those types of things, actually, people really love on social media, because it's the sort of thing that's a bit different. It's not preachy. It's starting a conversation. It's making you think a bit differently. And I think you do the same with your Train Journey Reads. It's finding these moments of ordinary life where you can connect with other people. So I really like that.
I think it's just. I mean, it's interesting you describe it that way, because I think it's sort of just like, it's almost like postcards of stuff that's going on in my brain, right? So I found this interesting. You might find it interesting.
Yeah.
Or not, right? And I don't. If you don't find it interesting, it doesn't matter, right? It's
Yes.
like, I'm just putting it out there. I'm just suggesting this might be of interest to you.
Yeah.
Equally, I've clocked something that I think is weird, brilliant, or even, I'm increasingly thinking, like, I spot stuff, I go, I don't actually know what's going on here, right? And so there's a bit of me that's also going to crowdsource things and put stuff out there that just goes, I don't know what this is. I don't know why they're doing this. What's the point of this?
But I think that's good, because also I think you could stop yourself quite easily from sharing ideas by being a bit over analytical about what this says about, and it goes back to what you're saying about the sort of blurring between yourself and the brand of, what does this say about my business? Am I being serious enough? Am I putting myself out there as an expert because I ought to know the answer, or whatever it is? And I think a willingness to make that a little bit messy, or a bit just, I don't have an answer to this, I'm just going to put it there because it's interesting. I think that those are actually more effective, and that I think people appreciate them more and are more likely to engage with something that's, not highly polished already. Do you find that?
Yes.
Do you notice
Yeah,
that
totally.
difference between posts that you've very carefully crafted that have a particular message, and something that's a little bit random? And does it surprise you what people do engage with or don't?
So there's a really interesting thing about engagement, which is there's visible engagement, right, which is the clicks and the likes. And then there's what, if we were being a bit mean, we'd say was sort of lurking, but I think is sort of just passive engagement. And I don't mean that in the sense of it's not going in. I mean the sense of there's no evidence of it taking place. And I get lots of people who say to me, I loved X. And I have had no sense that they have seen X, but they talk about it in enough detail that clearly they have seen it, right? This is not just sort of polite conversation. And so this stuff lands with people in interesting ways. And one of the things that happened to me early on was I used to worry about putting out content. I thought, if I put content out on social media, for example, then I can't then use that with clients. Right? That becomes a problem. Now that sort of feels logical, and I think this came from a line of thinking. So my dad loved doing historical research, and he was always like, "Why are you sharing all of your stuff?" And in the context of historical research, there is a limited thing. So if you have discovered something, putting it out there, you need to make sure that you own the idea going out there because there's a limited number of them. You spend a lot of time looking for stuff. Whereas the kinds of things that I'm sharing, every single day I come across stuff. So there's this unlimited supply almost of content. And so, one, I shouldn't be worried about putting it out there. But the second thing that's really interesting is that when people get in touch with me and say they've seen stuff, whether I knew that they'd seen it or not, often when it's clients, they'll go, "Can you please make sure you cover X in your presentation?" And they'll reference something I've put out online. And it's not a weakness for them to have seen it before. It is the thing that attracted them, and therefore they want you to include it. And then you go, "Is there anything else that I've put out there that you'd like me to
Mhm.
include?" And they're like, "Oh yeah, could you put these things in as well?" And suddenly, like a third of the time or quarter of the time is already taken up by the things they have told me they want me to. So far from being a flaw, it's actually a feature, right? Which is to kind of go, it helps them curate because you can then get a sense of what they like. And I found that really interesting because I thought it was almost, I treated it, I guess it's a bit like sort of jokes and go, didn't want to give away the punchline because then you can't tell the joke again. But actually, a really good joke allows itself to be retold. And then I realized that what was happening was people were seeing the stuff online and going, "I love that thing. That's what's grabbed their attention. It's engaged them. They've got in touch. They've talked to me about it. They loved it so much that they want to share that with that's the thing that's attracted them. And therefore, if I want to make sure that they, as the people hiring me within an organization, are happy for me to do that, I need to pick the things that resonated for them because that's what's grabbed their attention. And the logic would be that if it's grabbed their attention, chances are that they think it'll grab the attention of other people. And so there's this lovely thing of a very strange form of engagement I wasn't expecting, which is people getting excited about things and wanting a repeat performance. And I thought, well, maybe actually, if one take, and this is why I think you have to think in sort of parallel analogies. Why might that make sense? Well, the history analogy, the historical research analogy, is the wrong one. It's actually about thinking. I have to think more about, well, what happens with musicians, where they put a track out there, people like it. If there's a live show, of course, people want to hear that track. Right? It's the thing that they love, and actually, that whole thinking about other contexts in which people present stuff. It's been really interesting for me looking at other contexts in terms of what I do, particularly the speaking bit or the training bit of
Mm.
it. I've been looking at the music industry for inspiration. And one of the things I find fascinating about that is that, the convention of riders, right, where musicians say what they want in their dressing room and almost the terms and conditions under which they will perform. And there's always that thing about, oh, well, they're just being diva-ish, right? Making demands for the hell of making demands. But also one of the reasons they do that is so that they can peak perform.
Mhm.
So we want the dressing room a particular temperature so it doesn't dry out our voice, right? We need a particular type of thing because that makes us feel comfortable, puts us in the zone. And yeah, sure, some of them push their limits a little bit. But I've been thinking about the same thing. And how do I present to clients? And often I say to clients, look, this is the way I'm going to do stuff. So if you want to get the best out, if you're going to hire me, you want to get the best out of me, then to a certain extent, I should tell you how to do that by being slightly demanding, not in a dickish way, but in a kind of like, this is how to get out of me. So an example for my work would be, I often get struck by inspiration when I'm on the way to things. So my presentations are never finished in advance. They're always curated, at the 11th hour. Now that might be something I've discovered at the 11th hour in the venue that we're in, or it might be just an idea that I've had where the closer I get to having to perform, the more suddenly ideas will flow around my head, the more I'm focused on that particular event. And so it all comes together last minute. So don't ask me to send my slides in advance because if I send them to you and you force me to present those, you will get a much lower quality performance, particularly for that audience on that day, than if you allow me the latitude to show up at the last minute and present that. And
Yeah. Yeah.
actually, and to riff a little bit further, in a virtual thing, it's been really interesting for me because one of the benefits of virtual, we always say, well, in person is better than virtual. Right? And that's true. That's absolutely true, right? It's different. But one of the things you can do in a virtual presentation that you can't do in an in-person presentation is you can edit on the fly without anybody knowing. And so when I'm doing a virtual presentation, I will have a load more slides than I actually need. And one of the things that I am doing is working out, and that might be a combination of a question that's been asked or something that's occurred to me, or I'm running behind time, or I've got a little bit more time, or I'm riffing with something and suddenly an idea occurs to me and I want to drop certain things and bring certain things in. I have this longer data and you can do it behind the scenes without people even realizing. And actually, that means you can get a really, really, it's almost a higher quality experience, because if I'm going in a in-person thing, at some point I have to commit virtually. I don't have to do that. And I can jump the order around. I can do all kinds. It's hard work behind the scenes, but that's a tremendous benefit of a virtual thing. It really is curated on the fly.
That's really interesting. And I should say that we met because I organised an event, an annual event called Speak to the Human as well, that I'd invited you along to be the keynote speaker at. And I, as an event organizer, I really appreciate when speakers want to take that kind of approach. In fact, that is actively what I seek in a speaker, is somebody who isn't just going to come and deliver the same thing that they've delivered 20 times previously. I want them to read the room. I want them to engage with the audience. I want them to be willing to change something, or to speak to somebody, or to just be present. I want them to be present. And I think that that's part of what it means to have a good experience, both from the audience perspective, but also as the speaker, that you have some sort of rapport and engagement. And yes, that makes you a little more vulnerable, because you're having to take a risk. You're having to put yourself out there a little bit more. You're not just reading words from a page. But I think that makes it more authentic, more genuine. And if that means that things don't entirely go to plan or aren't completely polished, actually, as an event organizer, I'm completely
Right.
comfortable with that. I think that's totally fine. And I think in many ways it relaxes the audience, because they realize that you're there to engage with them. It's not they're being read to and lectured at. It's that this is about a two-way communication. It's about understanding what they want, what they're hearing, and yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
that's better. And but what do you think makes for a good experience, both as a speaker? By the way, picking up on a thread that you said earlier, next time you come to one of my events, I will make sure that I get the red M&Ms in a bowl ready for you. I didn't realise that you're this level of
Totally.
diva
Yeah.
now.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, no, no, I'll tell you which color I want. Thank you.
I'm
That's not.
sorry.
You don't get
I
to tell me,
apologise. Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. I've
But yeah.
got
So I think to your point, what and I don't know. Again, this sort of feels like a logical way to rationalize this. But I think if we're going to get people to give us their attention, whether that's virtual, whether that's in person, but particularly in person, right? Typically, if we've dragged them to a physical location, there's extra effort involved than just clicking something on your desktop. Right? If we've done that, we owe it to them to give them a performance that is special, right? That is worthy of their time. And I find it really interesting when you talk to, so I've sort of spoken to speaker bureaus and people like that. And one of the things that's interesting there is they always look for the exact opposite, right? They want to be able to go out and market a kind of rinse and repeat thing. Here's a speaker, and they have 20 different or 10 different presentations they delivered a million times to great acclaim. And I think that's really lazy, because I think if you're just rocking up and rolling out the greatest hits each time, the same thing, on some level, people can tell. And that for me is an on-demand product. That is not a live show. A live show needs to reflect the audience in that moment.
Mm.
And actually, if we look at comedians, if we look at musicians, everything from comedians handling hecklers in the audience to even the lamest concert, they're going to do a Good Evening Wembley or whatever, right? There's an attempt to localize at some level. And the ones that do really good shows go a bit beyond that and bring in some sort of local flavor, right? No two shows are the same, because they are engaging with that audience in that location on that day at that time. And they're reflecting what's happened. So if there's been something in the news that's relevant, some awful tragedy, maybe they want to reference it or something, just some sort of connection with the audience that's there. And I think people are entitled to that. And it frustrates the hell out of me that the model in so often is just sort of, well, we want people who've done this a million times before, delivering the same thing. I don't think that's good enough. I think in the 21st century, we need to recognize that people's attention is a valuable commodity, and we shouldn't expect to automatically have it. And the way that we get that attention for what we're doing is we think about them, and we engage with them, and we treat them like they're humans, not some sort of wall of robots that are forced to listen to what we say. And we've all been to things where somebody's kind of droning on about something. There's that famous scene from Ferris Bueller's Day Off, right, which is particularly relevant at the moment because they're talking about tariffs.
Oh God.
And it's like he's sort of and the joke is the teacher is droning on and repeating the same crap that they've done time and time again, and it's really boring, right? Hence, Ferris Bueller wants to back away from this crap, understandably. And we've all experienced teachers like that. We've all been in training sessions like that. And I just think that's not acceptable. And part of the reason I link this back to the pandemic is I think there's an interesting time when, as people were working from home, the battle for their attention shifted away from other corporate things to YouTube, Peloton, looking out the window, right? The pets at home, going for a run, whatever, right? There was something else there that had people's attention, and you were up against those things. And so I think that's the lesson for me there was we can't take people's attention for granted. We have to earn the right to be heard. And we don't earn the right to be heard if we just rock up and phone it in and give them some generic crap that's given to everybody.
Mhm.
And I think this is such a fundamental point, and it frustrates me. And we, just like I don't think it's good enough. If you're a speaker, you should be able, if you are, particularly if you're being paid, right? If you're a speaker, you should be able to manage those dynamics, right? You shouldn't have to have the comfort blanket of, oh, I will just say the same thing I said every single time. You need to be able to react to things, which is why, if there's a technical failure, you need to be able to handle that.
Yeah.
Right? I've had loads of situations where, and it was Rory Sutherland, previous guest on my show, who told a great story. He said, I've only ever seen a speaker lose the audience once. And that was when there was some sort of technical failure. And the guy starts screaming at the AV people.
Oh.
Like, and that caused Rory said that caused a visible thing in the room because that's not the done thing, right? You don't shout at the people that are delivering. That's just not right. And I had an issue. I was doing a presentation. Oh, I might as well say where was it? It was in the Isle of Man. And again, part of my mantra of go to interesting locations, right? The places you've never been to that you would never otherwise potentially go, right? Go higher up on the list than places one's been to before, right? And so I'm doing this thing, and something has gone wrong with my kind of slides. I think there was some conversion process that had happened or something. And so what I'd given them, anyway, what appeared on the screen was a mess, right? The transitions didn't work nicely. It was awful. Right? So in other words, I am slideless. And I just had this story about this guy that had lost the audience in the back of my mind. And I just thought I must do exactly the opposite. And so what I did was turn the scenario around and just went, okay, one, I'm not going to be fazed by this because shouting at people is not going to improve the situation. But secondly, I've got to win the AV because maybe there's something they can do to rescue this situation. And so I just started riffing and engaging with them and chatting to them and going, what can we do to solve this problem? And I actually got ultimately, there was they went to the original file, loaded it up on a different machine, blah, blah, and the guy goes, this is a separate clicker. And I said, no, why don't you stay on stage with me? You can do the clicking for me. I don't want to have to learn a new clicker. I'm here to present it. And make them part of the show.
Absolutely.
And
yeah.
Here's the ridiculous thing, right? What did people remember? Or at least what did people come and talk to me about afterwards? Was the fact that I wasn't freaked out by a screw up.
Yeah.
Right. And that probably, if I'm honest, that's probably the thing people remember.
No, of course,
as
because
a
it's
result
much
of
more
it.
interesting. It's
Yeah.
that, and I mean, your topic being human risk, it's kind of
Right.
relates to the topic itself. But I think that's so true. I think that ability, you turn these things into a chance for engagement or a chance to do something a bit differently. We have both interviewed two people that talk about this very well, who you met at the Speak to Human event. One of them is Heather Urquhart, who's a professional improviser,
Yes.
and the other is Hannah Williams, who's a live illustrator. And I've had them at Speak to the Human events, and they are both absolutely brilliant. In completely different ways. Heather is, so she's a professional improviser. She's, I think you did a double header interview
Yeah,
with
double
her.
header with
Yeah,
her.
it's
We got
awesome.
talking
It's
so
great. It's
much,
great
yeah.
hearing her talk about it. But she
Link to that in the show notes. Sorry,
yeah.
you're the host. You're hosting this one, but I'll just do that. Right.
And she uses things going wrong as an absolute opportunity for comedy or for engagement or for, connecting or making the next thing happen. And she spots those as chances to do something creative. The fact is she's incredibly talented at being able to do that in a moment. But the whole point being, it's better often. There's an opportunity to turn things around explore what this could mean for the situation that you're in. You know, I mean, it's the whole root of innovation, isn't it? But in this context, when you're in front of a live audience, there isn't such a thing as a perfect presentation. And if you're seeking it, you're probably thinking about it a bit wrong. You're looking for
Yeah.
engagement instead, and you're looking for ways that resonate. And I had a similar conversation with Hannah, who was I'm just about to publish a podcast interview with her. Actually, she creates illustrations. So she's at our event. She's at the back of the room, and she does. Yeah, she listens to the speakers and she creates this huge illustration through the day as they speak, which is amazing to see. And it's a fascinating form of communication, sharing ideas. And but we had a nice example of where things went wrong for us, where she was supposed to be working on a big board and
Oh,
the,
yeah.
the board didn't show up. I think, yeah, this was the year that you were keynote speaker, I think. And Hannah and I both kind of went, oh, well, never mind. Let's just stick a big piece of paper on the wall. It'll be fine. And actually, it was really nice because our theme that year was about navigating change and harnessing disruption. And she just turned it into a beautiful opportunity to go, this wasn't what I expected, but you know what? It's working out better for this, this, and this reason. And I just really like and appreciate that ability to respond in the moment to what's happening. And it's much more authentic, it's much more human. And do you know what? It often leads us to something more creative, more innovative, more human. But I do have a
Yeah.
question for you in amongst all of this, which is
G-
I love how you've talked about engaging with the audience, standing in front, being that more authentic self. But can we just dig into that a little bit more? How do you
Mm.
do that? How do you understand what that audience is, what the atmosphere is, what they want? How do you do that spontaneously while you're speaking? How do you know?
Well, so it's a great question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I have a full answer to it, but I think it's about recognizing that you start with it, recognize it's important, and that takes you out of the zone of lecturing and more into the zone of engaging. And that's why I quite like to think about, whether it's and I'm not suggesting I'm funny, good at singing or any of these things, right? But think about I like to take other contexts in which there is a requirement to engage with human. Now that might be a hotel check-in desk, that might be someone who's serving food in a restaurant, customer service, or it might be comedian, magician, blah 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 blah. All of those people on some level demonstrate a form of connection with the room, and there are various techniques you can use to try and connect with the room, but I think the start point is recognizing it's important. And therefore, particularly where it's not like I'm teaching someone first aid, right, where following protocol does become important, and riffing a bit, right, is dangerous because you've got to stick to the syllabus to make sure people understand stuff. You can't kind of get halfway through it's to put someone in the recovery position. I don't worry about the rest of it. You'll work out on the day, right? That would be absolutely so there. There are certain types of content where you have to the content has to lead a bit
Mm,
because there's a path that you have to follow.
mm,
Now, what I do doesn't require that. Right? There's no obligation. I don't have to get through all of my slides. I don't have to, even when I'm doing training on my stuff, it's not about all the full detail. It is particularly where I'm trying to inspire people or challenge them. And so that becomes the most important thing. And so if a diversion into something becomes important, if we've got less time, we just flex that and say, what can we do within the constraints of what's here? So, the slides suddenly fail behind. I've got to sit there and go, okay, how do I make this interesting for this audience? Or something happens outside the window that's interesting, right? Let's bring that. I mean, not literally bring it into the room, but maybe, right? But let's make that part of the show. Let's have this lived experience. And I think for me, the key bit is people can smell this a mile off. So in the same way that people can smell fear or desperation, they can tell whether you're having a good time and whether you're rolling with it and whether you're trying to engage them and trying to do. And so a lot of time I get asked things like, do you want to do polls? Do you want to do particular online things? Do you want to do polls? What's happening with Q&A? And do you want to do breakout rooms? And there's all these sort of artificial constructs. And I've recently, I was sort of historically, they've suggested I need to do a poll. Okay, this is how they normally do engagement. I better do a poll. And it's only recently I've just gone, if I think a poll is useful and serves a purpose for then I will have one, right? If I think a breakout room is useful, then I will have one. But actually, I needn't take their tools of the standard tools of engagement. This is what you must do, follow the playbook, because that's not that doesn't work for me. And so there may be other tricks that one can pull. And I'm constantly looking, I'm watching YouTube videos of people doing clever things in totally different contexts and thinking about how do I engage people. So I'll give you a really, really silly example, right? So I spend half my time in Munich. I'm a Bayern Munich fan, and I go to the games every so often. And one of the things they do when they're introducing the teams at the beginning, they read out both teams, but the home team gets a lot more attention. They've got videos for each of the players that come up, and they all do something silly. So one of them might give a salute, one of them might give a little gesture, one might doff their cap, whatever. Right? They've got their own these little personal things, these little short little videos. And one of the things I've been doing at conferences that I'm presenting at is conferences often send you a thing saying, please put this out on social media, right? And some of them are nicely designed, and some of them have a picture, and some of them are bloody awfully designed, right? They're just like no, like sort of slapdash. You can tell, right? So let's just pull this crap together. And I just think I'm not just going to on my social media feed put out crap.
Mm.
And I thought, what can I do? And so I started to put slightly cheeky pictures of me, right? Put a picture of me with a hat, right? I superimposed a bit of myself onto it to add some personality. And I just thought, couldn't it be cool to do video? And I was in the back of my mind racking my brains for what could I do? And then suddenly this idea of the video that they show of the team on the big screens in the stadium doing something slightly silly, I was like, oh, I can just borrow from that. Right, and because I wear hats in my videos, right, I've got an opportunity to do like a hat tip thing or something with that could make this really boring, sterile thing into something engaging and interesting. So there's an illustration of. I haven't done it yet, but I'm going to do it because it's just the idea. It might be terrible, right? But I'm just going to play with it, see what happens, and that might take me somewhere else. But that's what a ridiculous contrast, right? You've got a stadium that seats 75,000 people. They're introducing a sports team, and then some guy joking, right? What do those two things have in common? But the answer is it's about thinking about engaging people.
Totally.
And so I just, like it may fail, might be the worst thing ever, but I think I want to try it, right? Because it's piqued my curiosity. See, what would that be like to do that? And we'll see if it works. In the back of my mind, I think it could work. It could be interesting and different. Now, that's not me following anyone's template. That's just me going, I think this could make more interesting. Now, in social media's case, it's I want them to read the post or click on something or whatever, pay attention to it, right? So adding a bit of video to a static thing is obviously a good way to do that. And I think there's something quite nice about having a little bit of video on an otherwise static image, right? So could work quite well. So we'll play with that. Same techniques with presentations. Is no two presentations I ever do are the same, even for the same client on the same subject, because I'm speaking to that particular audience. There'll be something different. It may be you're in a different slot, right? So there's a difference between presenting first thing, just before lunch when people are hungry, just after lunch when people are going to food coma. You have to riff to the audience in that specific thing. But I think if you don't recognize that, you're not literally you're not reading the room. And I don't have a prescriptive idea as to what reading the room is, but if you're not paying attention to it, and here's the funny thing as well. Sorry, you did interrupt me whenever, Sarah. But here's the funny thing: is that people often go. So I've gone to events where it's kind of like being particularly corporate ones where there's been an edict issued. Right, nobody may have their phone or their laptop out, and I just sort of think, what are we doing here? And the logic is, I want you to focus on the content. Now, my view is that number one, there could be a really good reason why they have their phone out or their laptop out. And that could be anything from they've got something in the back of their mind. They're waiting for an urgent email. They're waiting for medical test results, whatever it is, right? There may be, or some urgent work thing where if I tell them they can't do that, that's just going to bug them, right? So why shouldn't they be allowed to be looking at a screen? But they might also be doing something that's highly relevant to the session. In other words, I say something and I mention a name and they may be Googling who that person is or finding some facts out. And I've done this myself, right? You hear something and you're like, that's interesting. I wonder if that's the same as blah, 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 blah. I don't want to ask a stupid question. I'll look it up for myself. Or they might be taking pictures of the presentation that's going on.
Yeah.
And I love that. And so my view is let people do that because they're going to want to do it anyway. And the job is to make your content more compelling than the digital alternative or the visual alternative of staring out the window, right? Or daydreaming.
Yes.
And that's the battleground. And so rather than pretending this, and the bit that I love about it is twofold, is one, let them do it. And I'm not, there will be some people doing, I don't know, like playing whatever, doing stuff they quote unquote shouldn't be doing. But who am I to tell them what to do? Make my content engaging enough so they don't want to do that, but also recognize that there is shock value slightly in being the presenter that goes, I'm totally cool with you having your laptops out. The organizational norm is you may not. Let's break that, right? Let's break that because it'll stand out more and people notice it. And actually, if you give them permission to do it,
Yeah.
they're less likely to want to do it, right? It's a simple, so it's totally on brand for my thing. Now, as I say, this is relevant to my content, but
Yeah, it feels very, very patronizing, doesn't it? To say you must not get your phone out. You're not trusting people to behave in an adult way if you are being punitive about it. But also, like the the event organizer and the speaker is responsible. They are responsible for making it engaging enough that, as you say, people want to listen and be present. And yeah, I think there are all sorts of valid reasons why. And it may even be that you're fiddling with something on your phone in a way that is the equivalent of doodling because it
yes,
actually helps you to concentrate on what's being said. But it may be something valid, it may not be. And actually, if it's not something valid, that's useful information that the organizer and the presenter should be paying attention to. Because if you're not holding the room, maybe you need to think about how you could be.
yeah, and we've all seen situations where if you ban stuff, right, you make it more popular,
Yeah.
right? We just know that intuitively,
Yeah.
and I think particularly for what I do, it is really, really, really important that I demonstrate, not talk about, but demonstrate, and at some level, an understanding of how humans tick.
Mm.
Because I can't credibly stand in front of an audience and go, you should engage it was really important that we engage people and understand them. Bracket, hire me to help you do that. Right. And again, right, actually the brackets hire me to help you do that is also an interesting one because I often get invited to things and people sort of fire a warning shot as if to go, please don't make it a sales pitch. And I'm like, I can't think of anything worse.
Yeah.
Right? People don't want infomercials. We've all been to conferences where software vendors or whatever have bought a speaking slot who, and then, and they're kind of like, I'm going to tell you about a problem. Oh, and here's our software solution to it. Let me give you a demo of the product. Right? It's not interesting for anybody. And so, if I'm going to demonstrate an understanding of how humans operate, then I need to live that. And I do, the best thing I can do is to leave people curious and go, I love what that guy did. I must find out more about it. Right?
Absolutely.
And of course you make that easy for them to do. So I'm not saying, I'm not sort of going, no, I don't have any services to sell. Of course, people ask questions about it, but like just pique their curiosity and leave them wanting more. And I see so many people not doing that. And I just, come back to, I think we don't have a right to people's attention. We have to earn that
Yeah.
right
Yeah.
because we're not at school.
Yes.
We're in an adult environment where people have other things going on and treat them like they're adults. Recognize that they might not want to be there. And your job is to make them be delighted that they were there.
Exactly.
Or at least some of the way to being delighted to be there.
Yeah, and you don't engage people by telling them that they need to be engaged. It's just not
Yeah,
how
yeah.
it works.
Right. I'm reminded of, like teachers that go, if you spend more time listening to me and less time insert distraction here, right, you'll learn more. Now, that might be true, but generally that was the place that teachers who were crap went to.
Yeah.
Right. That was the technique that they deployed to kind of go, I'm losing the room here. I need to exert my authority so that you will listen. Right. And I'm like, I just don't think that's right in an adult. It doesn't work. Right.
Yeah.
And you look really weak as well.
Yeah. So to move us on slightly, but in a related area to speaking, how does podcasting fit into the whole world of Christian? Why did you start a podcast?
Yeah.
And has it evolved in the way that you expected? What's it been like as a kind of journey?
So when I was younger, I really wanted to work in radio. And like, if there's one regret in my life that I didn't pursue at some point, was that. And I think partly, my university didn't have a radio station. I think if it had, that might have prompted a different thing. And I actually once recorded a professional radio demo. It wasn't a tape as such. It was a demo CD, right? But recorded a demo, got it done, professionally produced, and had someone advising me how to do it. And I never sent it off. I'm too scared. And I'd always wanted to have a podcast. And so as soon as podcasting came along, I was like, this is a potentially interesting thing. But I was employed by people. And I did the kind of thing that I advise people not to do now. But the thing I did at the time was like, I can't do that. I shouldn't, they might stop me, even though it didn't say anything in my employment contracts about podcasting, because it wouldn't, of course. but I just didn't do it. And so when I kind of broke, and if I knew that I was going to do a human risk thing while I was still working at UBS, and if I had a jingle prepped for the show in like 2016 or 2017, so I knew then I was going to do it, but I never, it's honestly irrational fear, right? Because if you think about it, right, what are they going to do? Either your show is so successful that they've noticed it, at which point you've got a successful show, or they don't notice it, at which point there's no problem and you're learning something. And so I was just like, I want to get a show and I'm going to do this. So 2019, when I'm stepping out into my own thing, I'm like, well, there's no excuses left, right? Because I'm the boss here. So I set this thing up. And again, I record a few episodes. I'm still too scared to put the thing out. I still don't know what I'm doing, blah, blah, blah. And the initial thought was, I will have a podcast that sort of backs the business up. Hence, it's got the name, the thing, and I'll sort of interview academics and people that, I don't know, can add some heft and gravitas to the business, whatever, right? It's an interesting topic. And I started to realize a few things. The first one was that the benefits of doing the show are massive to anybody that participates in either side. Because if you're the host of a show, there's a discipline there in terms of preparing for the show. So you read more than you need to read. So if I'm interviewing an author, I'm going to need to read the book and think about it and work out a line of angle that I'm going to take on that. So it forces me to, and you having an interesting conversation. And I always joke and say, some of the people I get in touch with, I sort of go, if I got in touch with them and said, can I have an hour of your time to chat? They'd probably tell me to piss off. But if you go, would you like to appear on my podcast, which is the same thing, right? They go, oh, that would be lovely. Thank you. I'd love to do it. So this is brilliant construct to be able to talk to people that I have never spoken to before in a frame context that's interesting. And the extended format means you're having a longer chat than you would ever be able to otherwise get with them. And so, that's been getting some people that I really wasn't, people like Dom Jolly, the comedian, right? Getting him on the show it was easier during the pandemic to get people in the early days. And I wish I'd paid more attention to that dynamic, but having those conversations is just brilliant. But I then, as I was musing on it, realized several things. The first one was, if that's such a big benefit, I don't have to worry about listener figures. And one of the things I think is interesting is that you can obsess about metrics. And as you know, podcasting metrics is a funny game in that I don't trust them. Right? They just don't seem to be reliable or sensible. You get a rough idea, and you can probably get it on a platform by platform basis, but an aggregated view of what people are downloading, let alone when they're listening to it, how much of the show they're listening to. Loads of people will sell you data that purports to tell this, but I've not found the stats particularly reliable. And so I just got to a stage where I was like, you know what, if it's such a benefit to me and I get to hang out with people, then forget the audience numbers. Just do a cool thing. If you build it, they will hopefully come. And I suddenly realized that I wasn't worried about that at all. I just wanted to keep doing this thing because it was delivering for me, and often for the guests as well, where they would say, I've never thought about that before. That was really interesting. Or I really enjoyed that. Or whatever, give them a great experience. And so just look at it and say, I probably shouldn't say this with PR people that get in touch with me with books and whatever, right? So I care massively about my listing figures, right? But I want to put on a good show. And then I'd like to think that if I'm enjoying it, engage with it, the listeners will follow. I might not get the highest ranking thing because I'm not chasing a whatever the podcasting algorithm is, but I'm just doing it for those reasons. And so I found just putting the thing out, it's found an audience, people are there, and I've just flexed it now. And I used to think I had to have anybody who published a book that was on a remotely related topic, get those people, let's get these people. And now I just look at it and go, I mean, literally, it's, can I be asked to do this interview? Is there something there that's gonna be, because, and here's the logic for it. Like, if I'm just phoning it in back to our speakers who are just doing the same old crap, then I'm just going to end up asking questions that are sort of generic and the kind of things other people can ask.
Yep.
There is no point in having someone on my show in order to replicate another podcast. It has to be driven by me. And so the criteria for who do I want on the show is not logical at all. It's human. It's going, do I feel like speaking to this individual about this topic? And it might be someone nobody has ever heard of on a niche topic that fascinates me. I've had people talking about German football. I know that will not be of interest to the average, but we get to some really interesting places and I can clip those interesting bits and talk more generally, use those for other things. But there'll be a small niche that likes that stuff, but that's part. I don't expect people to listen to every single episode. I bring people in that I think are interesting and I see what audience we can get for it. And sometimes, there's obvious people I had BBC's Ros Atkins on, one of the top downloaded episodes, right? Because he's famous and he's brilliant and he's written a really cool book and he's got really interesting, and it's a topic that's, how to explain things is a topic that's accessible to everybody. So as we look at that obviously that's going to do well. And obviously I want to have him on the show and I'm a big fan of what he does. And it was just amazing. But I'm also happy just to have people that nobody's ever heard of that are interesting. And the more I look at it now, I think my job is to curate a series of conversations that only I could have and the types of conversations that only I could have. So the success criteria are, we finish the episode and the guest says something to me like, that was great. I really enjoyed that. No one's totally different. Most fun I've had on a podcast, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. Right. That's way more important than how many downloads I've got. Because if I start with what do I think is going to fulfill me? What do I think is going to be good for the guest? I want to make sure they have a good time so they tell other people so that they don't feel like they wasted their time. And maybe we build a relationship outside the show. That's happened a few times as well. And if you start to look at it like that, it's less about downloads. And, that's why I don't have sponsors on the show, because I don't want I had somebody approaching me to sponsor the show. Thank you if you're listening. And I kind of had a discussion with them. And I said, look, I'm not going to take anybody telling me who to have or not have on the show. I want to be free to do what the hell I want. They were, yeah. We love you. We just want you to do your thing, blah, 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 blah. And I said, I'm uncomfortable with crass infomercial thing. I don't want it to look like there's any editorial control whatsoever. And I said, I want to be free to do what I want. And they were like, that's fine. There's only two things that we wouldn't want you to cover. And I went, well, we're off. We're not doing this then. And those things were politics. And I can't remember something else. And I just thought, well, there's a strong likelihood I'm going to do. And in fact, I did. Right? I had Steve Bell, who's a slightly controversial in some field, political cartoonist on talking about stuff. Well, that's politics for you, right? I've had someone who's now an MP on the show before. I've had perspective. So as I look at those things, right, I'm going to stray into those territories, and that's absolutely fine. And so to protect the show, and to allow those original objectives, I'm looking at maintaining that artistic freedom, and that's super important to me. And there's a business rationale there, by the way, which is, interestingly, if you are free of all these shackles, and I'm not saying, by the way, if there's a sponsor out there that genuinely wants to do this, that I think would fit nicely with it, I'm totally up for that. But I do want to protect that bit is really important. But the business rationale is fascinating because I've got some amazing clients off the back of the podcast, right? People back to sticking my tentacles in places I would never. I've done keynotes for incredible clients, some of whom I can't name, right? Just global names there who've gone, we love the show. And even if just the cost of it, okay, not my time, but the production cost, they were covered by one speaking engagement for an amazing client. And so if I look at it on that basis, if it's delivered nothing else, that second bit, and I will finish in a second, is to say the skills that you get by doing it, the ability to be very comfortable in front of a microphone, to understand how the tech works, to be not fazed by being asked whatever questions. And it's improved my ability to chair panels.
Right.
Because I was sat in a conference and there were 5 people there and my brain freaked and went, how the hell am I going to manage this? And my brain just went, this is a podcast with 5 people.
Yeah.
And suddenly it's like, boom, I have a frame of reference.
Yeah.
So I think it's improved my skills. It's built relationships, blah, 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 blah. I don't know why everybody doesn't have a podcast. And I know it's a joke, right? Like, I'm going to start a podcast, right? But I think if you approach it in that way, amazing things can happen.
Well, I think it's a really nice format. I like the format a lot because it feels like a real conversation. It doesn't have to be scripted. We probably start out with a vague idea of what we're going to talk about, but I really like how it feels like a genuine conversation. And when I'm listening to a podcast, that's what I want to experience. I want to be listening into 2 people having a chat. And I think that's what makes it really nice. But yeah, I mean, everything that you've been talking about relates back to what you were saying earlier on about and how I was comparing you to a collector of ideas. I think it's finding those connections that make sense to you, where you've maybe thought, oh, these things hang together for me, but maybe they don't for other people. But that's okay because I can see these ways of connecting.
Well, thank God they don't, in a way. It's because if we all made connections in the same way,
Yeah.
there'd be no need. I mean, I sometimes get really frustrated with my business where I'm like, this behavioral science stuff it's if you're trying to influence people, it's really important that you understand. You wouldn't go and do dog training if you didn't understand dogs,
Yeah.
right? Or you wouldn't teach a language if you didn't understand the language, right? So I think it's really important. And that seems to me blindingly obvious.
Yeah.
It is obvious with hindsight if you have made the leap and you are willing to make the leap, right? So it all fits together. But so I get quite frustrated. I'm like, why don't they get this? Why are they not doing it? And then I'm like, thank God they don't.
Yeah.
Like, because otherwise I'd have nothing to do.
Well, and I think being comfortable with the fact that it may not be an obvious connection. In fact, there may be no connection at all, and that's fine. It actually, what it reminds me of is this is a completely different world, but funding of academic research, I think, is a really, really interesting window into how people think. And the fact that with government funding, I'm talking about the UK, I don't know how it works in other countries, is very often connected to what is the likely outcome of the research. And that there has to be something that it's leading to in order to get more funding. And those things where they can point to an obvious outcome are much more likely to be well funded. And that is missing something crucial where the importance of innovation, where at this point, as we start, we have no idea what's going to be at the end of it. There may be nothing, but there may be something life-changing. There may be something that saves millions of lives. There may be something that opens up an entirely different way of thinking about something that's going to have X, Y, or Z value. We don't know. The willingness to explore ideas in that kind of open-ended way, where some of those things are not going to lead to something. I mean, obviously, that's a luxury and not, and it relates to risk and innovation and willingness to put money into blue skies stuff. And of course, there's a luxury to being able to do that in the first place. So I get it. I'm not an idiot. But I think you can apply that kind of thinking to something, not quite as expensive or on
Yeah.
the same scale, where it's like, we don't know where this is going to go, but let's do it anyway, because that's super interesting.
No, it's huge. And I think it's, what's interesting for me is, so there's this phrase, FAFO, right? Fuck around to find out.
Mm,
And that's always presented as a negative, which is kind of, well, they're fucking around now and they're about to find out. And there are times I recognize, right, jumping into deep water and seeing if you can swim when you don't know how to swim is not a smart strategy. That's stupid. But I think sometimes just idling around, doing nothing, playing is when we get some of our best ideas. I mean, I spend a ton of my time, and it's factored into my business model, doing things that might be a complete waste of time. I might go to a museum, right? There's bugger all to do with my work, but I think has something there that might spark something. It might not. Might
yeah.
be, or it might resonate in 6 months' time, right? Suddenly I pull two ideas together, but it's there in the database. And I think we should all be doing this, because actually, if you think about how do you differentiate yourself from other people, other businesses? So there's a business rationale of going and getting stuff. And back to the link to me being it's my business, right? I better make sure that I am the best version of myself. I don't get that by sitting in the same room, reading the same stuff, looking at the same thing, because then it just becomes this derivative. I need to be back to the podcast, meeting new people,
Yeah.
having my thoughts open to new things, new experiences, just doing cool things that are bugger all to do with work that might hopefully bring in some alternative thinking.
Yes.
That's not a luxury. So I agree with you. It's a luxury in the sort of first world problems territory, but I don't think it's a luxury for what I do. I think I have to do that.
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
if I
yeah.
don't do that, I become stale.
I meant luxury as in
Yeah.
with funding of massive projects rather than, but I think the where we
I
can
think
do it, it's entirely a good thing. Um,
Yeah.
so let's come back to sort of client perspective, business perspective,
Mm.
and stay with with this thinking about disruptive ideas, lighting those sparks in the imagination, getting people to maybe think a little bit differently or question assumptions. A disruption can be brilliant. It can be just what people need. But sometimes those things can be very uncomfortable, and particularly if people aren't ready for them, or if organizations maybe are trying to impose a change that people feel uncomfortable with. So I'm sure change resistance is something that you see a lot of. What what's your observation of that, and why do you think, kind of on a human level and on an organizational level, what's change resistance all about? What's happening?
I think we intuitively know that, and we all know from past experience, things we've done in the past, lots of times, become easier than things that we've not done. And so if we can get into routines, that's a lot easier. And we all have routines of some kind that allow us to get through the day. We probably all commute to work by the same route. We probably all have a sort of morning routine. Somebody once said to me, I was on a course, anyway, an academic, and he just went, if you think about the idea of routines, we all do it. If you think about what you do when you get into the shower in the morning, he said, if I were to watch you in the shower, and he went, oh, I better stop there. He said, that's not a practice. Wait, we do what you'll probably put the shampoo on using probably your dominant hand, but maybe not, right? You may have a particular order in which you wash. Let's just leave it there, right? And an order that you just do every morning, right? Because that's easy to get through life. So if we recognize, again, I think this is really interesting because if we recognize this in our personal lives, we know that that's what happens. Then, of course, the same thing's going to happen in a work environment, and we have less sense of control. At least in our personal environment, we can decide to put the coffee machine on before we go for a run or whatever, or have a coffee after. We're masters and mistresses of our own destiny. Whereas in the work environment, we're not. So we kind of know that change is awkward and difficult. And of course, if you have succeeded based on a particular model, a change can feel awkward and disruptive. It didn't do me any harm type logic is how we perpetuate sort of bad forms of institutional behavior. And so we kind of on some level know that the tried and tested, the way things have worked for us in the past feels good. And actually, even if it doesn't, even if we're sort of oppressed, we might go along with it, right? It's sort of just, it's the way things are. And so I think recognizing that is a big challenge. And so one of the things I have to do when I'm doing my work is to think that through and recognize that if I am coming in to have it, and if I'm going to have an impact, I'm going to be disruptive on some level, is recognize that that's there and that people will put up barriers and resist. Now, at some point, you have to walk away and go, there's no point in trying to persuade those people, right? That's not going to happen. But I've had people hire me so that they can get me to do a keynote and then argue with me in front of the audience, right? Literally pay to fight me, not physically, but I'm just like, what is going on, right? Why have you hired me if you think this is so bad? But fine, they somehow, I don't know, they enjoy the performative element of it, whatever. But I recognize that. And so one of the things I'm doing when I'm talking to people is I try not to say, this is what you're doing, you're a bunch of idiots, or words to that effect, or even emotionally transmit that. Instead, what I'll do is things like leading the witness, right? So I will, if I know they've got a particular problem, I might try and find a comparable situation where I explain what happens in the comparable situation. And then they'll say something like, oh, that's really interesting because that's very similar to what we have here. And I then have to stop myself from saying, yes, that's why I showed it to you. And I say, oh, that's really interesting. Gosh, is there anything we can learn from that? And they go, yes, we could apply that in this particular situation. I'm like, oh, really? Wow, I'd never thought of that. And then because they need to own it. I need to lead them. And I think it's recognizing those things. And that's why, my entire business isn't set up from, I'm going to come in and tell you how to do this. We together are going to solve your problem. It's going to be a collaboration, and I will bring some external expertise and challenge, and you will bring expert knowledge of the organization, what's acceptable politically, budgetary, what flies, what's like, find the right language, and we work on this stuff together. And I think from a consulting business, that's much more sustainable because what happens then is they co-own the solution. And that's really important in a regulated environment where if we're doing something that a regulator might be interested in, you don't want to be saying, well, we changed the way we do training or whatever, because this guy told us to do it that way. They want to be able to own it. And that also means that if something doesn't work out the way we originally intended, which will happen, they can course correct without having to come back to me. And so I think it's much more sustainable. And I know this is the way Actian thinks as well, right? This is much more about helping people to get to a point where they're comfortable with it. It's not an imposed solution. It's one we've co-created. You can genuinely own it. And actually, it's not about us being the stars of the show. I was talking to someone the other day who said something really interesting to me, which is whenever we as consultants or advisors or whatever we want to use, trumpet what we've done in the past, it's really tempting to own the client's victories. To sort of imply that because of what we did, this increased their revenues or, in my case, achieve compliance. Well, that's nonsense, right? It's the client that's done the thing. Of course, we've contributed to it, but we shouldn't be selling ourselves as if we're owning their solution, right? We helped them to do this, but let's talk about them as being that they should be the hero of the story, not us. And I think that's a really subtle point, and it shows a degree of confidence that you recognize, we are advisors to the kings and queens. We're not the kings and queens ourselves. We shouldn't be the stars of the show. We should be helping them to do that. And I think that's about, we've got to recognize their resistance to being told what to do by us. It's a co-creation piece. So all of that to me points to being empathetic, right? Back to the audience in the room, listening to them, recognizing that they might be tired if it's been a long day. They might not want you shouting at them very loudly
Yeah.
if, doing whatever, like just being there. And so I think it's about understanding humans. And if your business purports to understand human being, you better show that you do. Otherwise, you have no credibility. Even if you know the science, right, is can you engage with people? Because they're not going to want to hire someone that doesn't engage. If you can't engage them in a formal setting or a podcast or whatever, then there's no chance in the heat of the moment that the things are going to improve.
Well, that connects so well with a lot of the things that we've been talking about, right back to what you were saying about C2C. We might be working in B2B, but fact is we're dealing with humans on the other end of it, or how people feel patronized in a room if you tell them that
Right.
they have to be engaged. There's something, really deeply psychological and particularly about change, where there's just that level of very natural discomfort with something that you are being asked to do. You didn't perhaps choose to do it. And so it's much, much more powerful to give people, I think, to give people agency and help
Yes.
them feel like, even if it wasn't what they wanted, that they can own it, that they have a way of making it their own, doing something that feels like they're going to put themselves back in control of their own situation rather than defeating people with logical argument. You can shout, you can put arguments to people, you can persuade them, you can put all the logic in front of them, but ultimately, even if somebody can't come up with arguments against, their backs against the wall, they're not going to feel good about it. They're going to really dislike that situation. So that sort of real human psychology about change resistance, I think, is super important. And
Yeah.
I completely agree with you about it being a sort of human empathy piece.
Well, I think also to your point is we are seeing now there are people that are denying fact, like that are denying science. We've seen that. Right? I'm talking physics. I'm talking natural sciences as opposed to social sciences. Right? We've seen people who are telling us the things that we have that are just lying. Right? Politicians that are trying to spread a particular thing, or conspiracy theories that are believed.
Mm.
So we can see that even when it comes to the truth, that causes problems.
Mm.
So if we're then looking at sort of persuading people with ideas where there isn't necessarily a single version of the truth, you've got to recognize that if that dynamic applies where there is a single version of the truth, then we've got to really understand this and how that plays out and therefore being, as you say, empathetic towards the people that we're trying to engage.
Yeah, absolutely. Christian, this has been such an interesting conversation. I'm sure that we could talk for several more hours, but we probably need to stop at some point. And I am cheekily going to round off this podcast by bringing the question that I ask at the end of my podcasts on Speak to the Human. So it's bringing it back to you and speaking to you as a human, Christian. I want to ask what's exciting you at the moment and what are you looking forward to? What's motivating you most, either in or out of work?
I am absolutely so AI fascinates me.
Hmm.
Not so much the doom mongering or the kind of like overly excited fanboy stuff, but what interests me is what it's doing to us as humans, like how we're interacting with it. And I want to give a shout out, and he's coming back on the show soon. A guy called Jamie Bartlett who writes about this stuff, and he writes about the intersection of humans and technology. And he was talking about how our teachers handling the fact that their pupils can cheat, using AI, right? Get AI to write your essays for you.
Mhm.
And spoiler, he came up with this brilliant. He said, there's human ingenuity in dealing with that. So one of the ways that teachers deal with that is if they suspect that a pupil has used AI to generate an essay, what they do is they go and get the AI to generate 4 more generalist responses to the thing and call the pupil in and go, right, here's 5 of them. Which one was yours? And if you've just got AI to generate it, you've got no idea which one was yours,
Mm.
right? You can't stand behind it. And I was just like, that is brilliant. Right? That's just really cool So we've got this problem caused by the tech, and then we've got human ingenuity to kind of solve. Now that's not a sustainable solution, right? Because the kids will get wise to it. But if you're smart enough to think like that, you'll come up with other ideas. And so what is the tech? So there's a good example of tech doing something really interesting to us. And I keep finding use cases for it to test me out, to challenge me, to read things I've written and determine whether I'm, am I being prejudiced in a particular way? What am I missing? Help me write responses to people that have pissed me off or where I want a particular outcome so that I can think about just how is it improving me. So that bit absolutely fascinates me. And then the second thing that really intrigues me at the moment is I'm just looking at models of the world, the things that we use to put structure in place. And that might be political models, it might be transport models, it might be mental models. And I'm just sort of questioning, are those fit for purpose? And if we look at some of the challenges, patriarchal society, right? Things designed for men as opposed to for everybody. I think that thinking goes way beyond. So I was thinking about etiquette, for example. Now, etiquette sometimes is, this is the way you hold a spoon. Sometimes that's really sensible, right? Because it helps you to use the implement better. But sometimes it's designed in an exclusionary way so that they can tell that, like how to use a particular type of piece of cutlery. It's not obvious. And, I can tell that you're not one of us because you haven't got the right tie or whatever, dress codes, all these sorts of things. So I'm just fascinated by that stuff and looking at what structures do we use? Because often it's not about having order. It is about subjugating people and not getting the best out.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want to say, let's keep the bits that work well, but let's recognize, and I will use this term, oppressive structures. And I'm using it to bring the two things together is I'm using AI to think about those dynamics and sort of challenge those models.
I love it. As always with you, Christian, there's just like, you've just served up a whole new plate of ideas and conversation starters that I'm like, oh, yeah, we could just chat about that. Can we just maybe let's spend 20 minutes talking about that? But
No,
yeah, we have to be self-disciplined. That's so interesting. And there's already stuff in there that I'm like, oh, yeah, no, that's prompting this idea. But yes, we need to round things
we
off.
do.
And
We do.
thank you so much for letting me do this. It's been super fun. I've had a good time being the takeover host. So thank you for being up for it and being human risk in practice. I've enjoyed it a lot. Really good to hear all your thoughts and have that peek behind the scenes. So thank you, Christian.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for doing that. She's a brilliant idea of yours, and I hope people found it interesting. Before we go, you should plug your podcast, which is always worth a listen. Tell people how they can find that and you in general.
Yeah, so it's Speak to the Human, and you can find it on actioncommunication.com. It's our website. Just go to the podcast page on there. We regularly post them on social media as well, so you can follow us on Action. Action Communication and Learning on LinkedIn is probably the best way, or follow me. I'm Sarah Abramson, Abramson. You can find me on LinkedIn, and it'd be good to share that. So yeah, thank you for that.
Amazing. I will put links to those things in the show notes, as I normally say, including your appearance on this show and my appearance on your show, just in case people haven't had enough of us. But look, thank you for being an amazing host of the show. I have thoroughly enjoyed myself, and the opportunity to talk about myself is never one that I'm going to turn down. But thank you for making that happen.
Thank you. Thanks. It's been brilliant. That's great. And bye for now.